Well, welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, and this is one of our Tuesday evening webinars. In these webinars, we get people to talk about a number of issues, some of the big issues that affect us in the 21st century. And we cover a broad range of subjects. Now, today we're going to look at Europe and Britain, and we've called it What Next? Because whether we stay in the European Union or leave it, and Brexit suggests we're going to leave it, what will happen is we're going to have to forge a new relationship with Europe and the rest of the globe. Now, what will that be? What sort of Europe will it be that will be in a few years' time? Will it be a stronger Europe with us outside of it? Will it be a Europe that fragments because of rivalries and discontent? Or will it be a greater Europe, which involves countries that aren't in the European Union and a new form of sort of alliance? We don't know that, and it's just being debated. Now, we've got Ken Sweeney with us today. Ken is from Europe United, and that's an organization that looks at some of these big questions. And he works with a number of organizations that also consider some of these big questions. So we're going to ask Ken to do a presentation about what his view on this is now. And then we're going to come back and take your questions and your comments and put them to Ken.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. I'll just give you a quick background information on Europe United. We're a non-profit Irish-German organization. We're based in Ireland, and we focus on European issues and current affairs. Really, our goal is to help to encourage conversation and opinion on the Europe of today through our own publications. And we also, to do this, we provide a platform that supports aspiring writers. We don't have professional journalists. We have normal, everyday citizens just like ourselves. So I guess we need to look at the question of Europe. And the one thing that always sticks in my mind is that common phrase, we are where we are. It's a statement that has become a well-used phrase to describe the lack of ability to do something when faced with chaos. So we are where we are, and while we don't probably wish to be where we are worryingly seem to not be so sure where we are going. And that really applies whether you're pro-European, Eurosceptic, a Brexiteer, or a Remainer. All of us seem a little lost right now. And why has it happened? Well, I think there are many factors, but for me, one of the big problems is the rush to do something without really thinking it through. And that, for me, is the epitome of Brexit. Britain is leaving, but it has absolutely no idea where it's going. And as far as Europe is concerned, there's a similar situation, and there is a sense of being unsure where its future lies, but not as precarious as Britain, in my opinion. Nobody can deny that the recent rise in popularity of the right is a worrying factor, but is it going to result in the destruction of the EU? I really don't think so. These are difficult times that all democracies face, and such is the way of politics, in that sides will gain and lose popularity. But as long as we can maintain the institutions and ensure that they are stronger than any political movement, then I believe it's a safe institution. How do we do that? Well, I think we do that by ensuring that our citizens are informed, interested, and above all, they're involved. Over the last 10 years, governments across the world were preoccupied with this massive financial chaos that fell upon us around 2008. In particular, the EU was hit hard, mainly due to the fact that a number of its smaller states, and even its larger states, were seriously in debt. Now, how those member states recovered was different in a lot of ways. And the diversity in handling their debt, for me, showed that the concept of a united EU was still quite a way off. But the recession showed that the EU was in limbo. It is no longer an economic bloc, but neither is it a state. It has a unified currency, but only in certain member states. It has no fiscal union. Its parliament is overseeing, but not the deciding element. And it issues funds, but can't advise where it's used altogether. But most importantly, because it makes some decisions at a local level, and not all, it left itself open to scrutiny and eventually complete disdain by some of its citizens. And I guess that brings us back to Brexit. which I think was probably one of the most ludicrous political decisions in modern European history. But the funny thing is, it wasn't ludicrous because Britain was leaving. It was ludicrous because it was leaving and yet it had no idea what to do next. It only tells me one thing, that really, for me, the concept of Brexit was never really a reality for anyone, even the most hardline Brexiters. In the cases of the Eurosceptics within the Conservative Party under Cameron, it was a concession, and an utterly dangerous one, to keep them on side. His plan probably was to give them what they wanted, get the result of no, and then carry on all happy. In the case of UKIP, for example, it was even bigger blunder by them. They had seen the Leave campaign as a long-term weapon to become the second party behind the Conservatives, and obviously past Labour, who seemed to me were still in remission from Blair and the period of New Labour. Their plan seemed like to run the referendum, lose, but claim some kind of moral victory, and then pull in all those who voted Remain but won't support the Tories, and thus go into the next election with an existing mandate boosted by disgruntled Brexiteers. And the end result, in their eyes, could have been a coalition with the Tories and the likes of Farage, then having real influence over British democracy long term. Once their position in government was sealed, the name change probably would have happened, and then they would have silently dropped maybe the whole Leave campaign over a period of years. But these plans failed miserably because they didn't bank on the press, social media, and people reading the headlines and taking them as fact, and thus voting on this. And now Cameron is gone. UKIP have imploded, and Britain is in some sort of disarray with no real plan for the next 20 years, never mind the next 2 or 3 years. So in the case of Britain, we're going back to that phrase, they are where they are, and they still have no clue where they're going. And as much as I would like to believe that Brexit could be overturned, I'm still on the side that some form of Brexit will happen. It may be a soft one, with membership of customs union and single market still being a case, and I personally would hope that the situation on my country, in the island of Ireland, will stay as it is, with an open border and freedom for everything, because that's what we enjoy today. For me personally, the status quo of Ireland is paramount to any decision that Britain makes with regards to its membership. And as a European, it is very sad to see the EU lose a member, but the future of my own country comes first. And I am also relieved to see that the EU has adopted a no-nonsense stance with regards to, say, in the Irish problem and the Irish border problem. And here in Ireland, that has been seen as a positive thing in relation to how the EU is portrayed. Because realistically, Ireland could have been in this situation that Britain was in back in 2008, because it was forced to adopt very strict financial measures in order to access bailout grants. But there were threats to quit the euro and threats to even quit the union altogether. But yet that didn't seem to happen, and it remains a very loyal state, with even a recent Red Sea poll showing over 90% in favour of EU membership. So I think Ireland is coming across as being a little bit stubborn to some members of the British government, but for many people, I think, in Europe and particularly in Ireland, of course, it's a milestone in the history of relations between these two countries. The Ireland of 2018 is a modern, progressive society that is viewed as a valuable member of the EU. And for that reason, I think the Union has got to stand by its member. We don't seem to have been enveloped by any of the right-wing waves that is sweeping across the continent. And we recently voted, of course, for equal marriage rights, and will soon amend our constitution in regards to abortion. And I believe that states like Ireland are crucial to a future EU, because they are small, but showing to have a stable democracy, which does not seem to be reacting to any negative impact such as Brexit or even the immigration crisis. But we can make the mistake of laughing off Brexit as a political blunder, and particularly a one-off one. There's still a deep anti-EU sentiment in a lot of EU states, which I think seems to be fueled by a general feeling that Brussels has too much control, and is forcing the states to adopt practices that their people don't generally support. Some of those sentiments may have truth in them. And the fact that the EU is failing to address a lot of these issues, most notably the refugee problem, as we have even found out yesterday, where a ship has been denied entry. So it's not helping their cause, particularly in Eastern Europe and on the Mediterranean. I think in order to combat the rise of anti-EU sentiment, there needs to be solutions that can make an impact on a local level, as well as an international one. It must be seen to be addressing the refugee crisis, for example, by adopting solutions that are suited to the areas affected. One type solution is not going to solve it, and throwing money at it won't solve it either. So we cannot continue to pay off the likes of Turkey, because we will only end up being a cash cow. And if Turkey is getting well paid for holding on to refugees, then it may continue to ensure that that problem is not entirely solved. So I think the EU must be moving to solve problems at the sources by helping those nations to allow their citizens to remain and not have the need to come to Europe. Now, of course, many will still come, and it's really a long game we're playing here. And the EU needs to tell the truth to its citizens and try to convince them that there isn't going to be a short, sharp solution. The reason that people are coming to Europe isn't just because of war, it's in environment, poverty, and so on. So we always must be mindful of that, and we must be willing to accept these people. This isn't the plan for them to take over or install some fundamental regime. There are real reasons why these people are coming, and the EU needs to recognize that, prepare for it, and have solutions. But it also needs to let their citizens know what they're doing and allow them to be involved. Now, the citizens, if they're involved, they may make decisions that the EU may not like, and that even could involve changes at a fundamental level. But that is the case of the world today, and we sometimes have to adopt new measures to save bigger measures. I mean, we only have to think about what's happened yesterday with Trump and so on. These people are acting outside of the box, and we could be left behind in changes and not have as much influence as we should have. But we can't allow the current situation to continue, because it will cause more anti-EU sentiment, and it may result in a possible fracture of the Union itself. So the EU must have a positive plan that involves the people of Europe. The refugee crisis exposed one huge issue about the EU, and that is that it ultimately failed to communicate with its citizens. Many commentators and citizens constantly complain about that the EU has a public relations problem. But I actually don't believe this is the case. I think it's actually quite worse. I think that the EU has no relationship with its public at all. And if it wants to be there for the citizens, then it must be side by side with them. Now, the question is, how can we do that? Well, you can start by looking at a federalist model. And the future of Europe is probably going to be a closer integrated one, but it can only work if the people are involved at a local level. The EU should never be seen as a super state. It must be a civil society where the people can play an active part in the day-to-day running of the regions, their regions, and then vote on larger issues after a clear information and fact campaign is sent out to them. I noticed, particularly in Britain, commentators are looking at how the recent referendum in Ireland regarding the abortion question was handled. And the positive aspect that came out of that was that generally the people were very informed, and that the government here in Ireland had produced a plan where people had the information that they required, and they were able to make a very informed decision. And I think the rest of Europe could learn from that, that they should learn that people, once they have the right information, that they can be trusted to make the right decisions. They may not sometimes be even popular decisions, but they may be the right decisions. So we cannot allow another uninformed referendum like Brexit happen ever again. If we want to have a future Europe which is united, and whatever that may be a federation, a confederation, really that's not not the issue right now, but it needs to allow time and space for people to make informed decisions. Now, we can't expect to have a referendum on everything, of course, but crucial issues like human rights, healthcare, and the economy can be open to citizens at a local level. By allowing them to become individual members of the EU, we are giving them a stake in the Union. And as such, we're ensuring in their best interests to remain as citizens. Because really the EU needs to make its citizens shareholders in a future Europe, which takes me back to my first statement: we are where we are. Yes, indeed we are where we are, but how we proceed is vital, and we must not do as the Brexiteers did and rush to that decision with no idea of the consequences. I really hope that one day, if it may be the next year or even the next decade, that Britain, in whatever form it may be then, decide that it is indeed a better idea to be inside the club rather than looking in from the outside, and be an active member of future, more united Europe. Because the world is getting smaller and the concept of nation states is changing, and as is the balance of power. And history or prestige just may not be enough if you want to compete on the global stage. Is the solution more unity? I think it might be. And I think that the theory just does not apply to Britain. It applies to EU as well. But both entities are definitely at a crossroads historically. And whatever move they make, either be separately or as jointly, will determine the future for decades to come. And will, of course, affect us as well. And all of us individually. And I truly hope that the decision at the end will be a closer union. As I said, I think the federalist concept could be a runner. It will have problems, particularly in trying to convince people how deep that federal union should be, and how much sovereignty should nations, to use a better term, surrender. But, you know, it could be a confederation where the union is there and only major decisions are made, such as military and economics and healthcare. But as I say, whatever that decision is, people must be involved, and there must be a long run into it. There can't be a rush towards union in any way, shape, or form, just as much as there could not be a rush towards division. So I hope that will be the future.
Anyhow, thank you, Ken, for doing that. I mean, you've given us really, really good ideas about our own thought processes of what Europe is and where it should be going, and what the future might hold for all of us. But one of the things that you said, which is interesting and which makes me think that really Europe has lost its big idea now, isn't it? And that's one of the problems. I mean, when the EU started, it was an attempt to try and get peace in a continent that had been divided by war. And that was its big idea. And we're losing that, and we haven't got a new big idea to replace it. And without that big idea, Europe is, in ideal terms, falling apart.
Yeah, I think the issue with that is that probably the people who actually remember that period of time are no longer with us. So the whole concept of fighting fascism and coming out of a Europe that was devastated from the late 1940s, no one is around. Not an awful lot of people are around to remember that, and people have short memories. So you're absolutely correct. Europe does need to have a new goal, a new mojo. So I think what they've been trying to do over the last, say, 10 years is that they've been trying to push a youth policy with Erasmus and many hundreds of youth initiatives that have been coming out of Europe. And that's certainly a very honourable thing, and it does have a good concept in it. And we won't know what the result will be, what the result will be on maybe in another 10 years or so. Will we have more pro-European or whatever? But I do think that they must also not forget the fact that generally the middle income earners of Europe are the people who are basically funding the European Union, particularly in the wake of, say, the 2008 problems. So if I was to suggest, I think we need what's happened over the last 10 years in the trying to get the focus on the economic side of it. Civil societies have struggled. Many civil society organizations across Europe have been denied funds. They've been closed down. And I think there was, I'm not 100% sure, but if I'm correct, there was an initiative passed yesterday or the day before in the Parliament, which would see more funding going to civil society organizations. So I think that's a positive factor, because civil society organizations are wide-reaching and they encompass a lot of citizens of Europe, regardless of background, age, or demographic. So maybe that could be the future of Europe, where they actually begin to focus on that aspect rather than, as you say, looking at a sort of a past goal, which in many respects has been achieved. I mean, will we see Italy ever go to war against Spain or France against Britain? Highly unlikely. So I think that has been a success. But as you say, there needs to be a new mojo.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, you've mentioned some big ideas. You talked about a Europe of civil society, which is important. You talked about a possible new federal model. Sharon Nair on the Facebook site, for example, has mentioned, is it a positive a step to allow individuals within the UK, whatever happens to us, whether we leave the EU or not, to still be EU citizens? And that's a sort of big idea as well, isn't it? A Europe of citizenship that embraces people even outside the formal European Union. Is that an idea that we could sort of engage with?
I think you have to be a state in order to initiate that plan. And as I said earlier on, the problem is that the EU is in a little bit of a limbo. It's no longer the EEC, but it's not the United States of Europe. So in order for it to, say, have a situation where people can become citizens of Europe, I think it has to have a much more solid setup. So it needs to be a real state in order to have that. Now, the question is what is the motivations of people to become citizens of Europe? Right now, for people like Sharon, obviously, it's to remain as a citizen of Europe and to reap the benefits of European membership, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. I mean, if we can find some way of adopting that, ASAP, I'm certainly in favour of that. I think there's probably the percentage of people who would probably take that up would be quite low. So there wouldn't be a huge onslaught of people willing to become European citizens. So yeah, I mean, I'm in favour of it, but I just think that the European Union is not quite there that it could actually have that initiative and it to be kind of formally recognised.
I had a question here from Hannah, asking about March 2019, when we come to it, would the housing market be crushed or should it be unaffected?
I think it might be affected in certain countries. I mean, certainly Ireland could be affected by that. But I really think the issue about March 2019 is that no one really knows what's going to happen. But I think everyone is trying to prevent the worst case scenario, which is I think there was leaked in a memo last week into some of the British press where food would run out and all that kind of thing. I generally on the side of thinking that things can be over exaggerated. So I don't think the dark days of March 19 is going to be as bad as people make out to be. But yeah, for sure. I mean, people should keep an eye on things like that. But I wouldn't say I'm an economist, so I couldn't really predict that. But I would say that generally, I think a lot of the people who are negotiating it on both sides are doing their best to prevent, the worst case scenario happening.
Okay. I mean, we're talking about a new idea for Europe. We're talking about it in very optimistic and positive ways. But as Neil Bailey is saying, that in some countries, I mean, we've seen it in the populist rise in Britain, but in some countries like Poland and Hungary, we've got a very authoritarian type of democracy. And it goes against really the tradition of Western European democracy. And Neil asked, would you rather live in Sweden or Viktor Orban's Hungary? Like Europe to be Sweden or Hungary.
Sure.
The big idea could actually be not the idea we want. It could be, as far as Hungary and Poland and maybe other countries, Britain, a much more authoritarian Europe. Now, how do we tackle that? I mean, it's not all positive, is it?
No, but having said that, I mean, I can actually speak from a lot of experience. I mean, my wife is Polish, so I've seen Poland over the last 15 years go through obviously a democratic development. I generally would kind of believe that we must give countries and states like Poland and Hungary a little bit more patience, because they are where we were maybe 40 years ago, and democracy is still a relatively new thing to these nations. And I think although we do seem to have situations where we have political parties who would be viewed as extreme right, and yes, they are not, you know, they're not probably portraying themselves in the best light possible, but democracy is still there. So I think it goes back to what I said, that people need to be informed, and the EU needs to make sure, and those who are involved at a local level in those countries who are working very hard, organizations like KOD, for example, in Poland, are working very hard. What they're doing is they're trying to inform people that there is an alternative, and that, you know, not all liberals are, you know, all for, you know, mass emigration and all those kind of things, because those are just all crazy myths, propaganda myths. So I think what we need to do is give those nations a little bit more patience. We need to allow democracy to develop, and we need to make sure that the organizations that are working hard to make sure that democracy works in those countries are well funded and they're well informed. So I would probably say that although we do have, you know, there may be the probability that some of those countries may actually attempt to leave. I think it's slim. They still need the European Union. They need it in more ways than we probably think about. So I'm hopeful that the passing of Orban will be soon. Kaczynski's PIS may fall out of favour, just as all parties do. So I'm being optimistic again, but I'm saying that I trust democracy, as long as we make sure that democracy is constantly, people work hard with democracy.
The problem is, on a world scale, we're seeing a new model of democracy.
Yes.
We're seeing it in Russia,
yes, we are.
we're seeing
yes.
it in China, we're seeing it in Hungary, and so on. We're seeing an authoritarian form of democracy which has mass support of the people.
Yes.
And that is a big challenge to us, isn't it?
It is, and I think that the only way you can do that, you can't fight it hand in hand. So you've got to make sure that people they're informed. We saw it in our country. Our country was very. 10 or 15 years ago, would we have passed a marriage referendum? You know, equal marriage referendum. Would we have passed on abortion referendum? Probably not. But I think what we should do is we should use the tools that we have, social media, a much wider availability for information, and we should be making sure that we use those tools to inform people and make sure that they make an informed decision. Now, they may even make the decision that we may not like. You know what? I also believe that if we are going to have maybe a push towards federalism, we probably could lose some EU members. But would we be losing them for the right reasons? Well, maybe the federalists would probably say yes. So we should always maintain good relationships with them. And I think Brexit is a great test case. We mustn't go to get into the gutter politics that maybe some of the media want us to do. We should have a good relationship with Britain, regardless of what the outcome is, because there may, and there probably will, in my opinion, come a day when Britain will step back into the European club. And I think the same applies even to some of the Eastern European states. But I do take your point. As I said earlier on, we only have to see what's happening yesterday. There seems to be a celebrity-style politics coming through, with people, you know, like Dennis Rodman having a massive, platform to speak his mind. And we need to be wary of this, but we probably shouldn't be so dismissive of it, because we have had celebrity presidents in the United States before. So it may some people may come who would be valuable, but as you say, we need to be aware of it, and we can't be left behind.
If you had a choice, would you choose to live in Sweden or Hungary?
It's like, I think I've already answered that question. I mean, as I say, my wife is Polish, so I have a lot of experience of living in an Eastern European country. And, you know, on the streets, people still, go to Cafe Nero. They still drink their coffee. You can still go and see Star Wars. You can do all these things. So while I do understand that in the background there is a lot happening that is maybe scaring people, but I trust democracy. And I think, again, it goes back to the point of every nation has its problems and every nation has its situation that could be off-putting. But, you don't make those decisions based on the outside view. And for myself, would I live in Poland, which is probably compared now to Hungary? Yes, I probably would. But I would make sure that my children who live there would be well educated in how democracy works, and again, they make an informed decision, and maybe they can step into politics and make a difference. So you can't just stand by and let these strong men, tell you what to do. Those days are long gone, and I think we need to make sure that message is given to the people.
Michelle made an interesting point that I think we could generalize out, and she said, is Euroscepticism a misnomer for, in this country, people feeling that Britain is no longer at the top of the pecking order, and if we're not, we're going to leave. And when you have a Europe with 27 states and maybe expanding out beyond that, you don't have that tight-knit Europe that you did when it was originally formed many years ago. And you're going to have countries wanting to get their own advantage all the time. And so people are going to be wanting it being at the top of the pecking order. They're going to be wanting to get what they can get out of it. And how can we expand Europe and still prevent that happening so we don't break up into a sort of quarreling petty nationalism?
I suppose you need to look at each nation's strengths and allow them to succeed in that. For example, Ireland, it would be 20 years ago, would have been seen as a country on the very edge of Europe. Even today, some people would be still thinking it's part of the UK. It's a problem that we generally have here, but that's changing obviously with the world opening to a wider globe. But I think in terms of Ireland, we have a very good, pharmaceutical industry here. And I think if Europe is to, as you say, keep nations in favor, well, then they need to look at what they're good at and allow them to be good at that. And also, we should be thinking about more of a regional way as well, because I think what the myth about federalism is that it takes sovereignty away from states. But actually, if we look closer at Europe, I don't even think some of the modern states would even, are around that long. So, we need to be looking at a regional level, and federalism can help in that respect, in that it can give regions more autonomy, give them more pride, and they would see that as a positive aspect. And so you're dissipating on that kind of sentiment. There will always be Eurosceptics, though. So as long as the European Union works hard on a local level, which is something that I've been talking about a lot tonight, I think we can dissipate that problem.
Okay, Fong?
Yes, it takes a lot of resources and time and energy to look after those people, to take care of the countries with special needs, kind of, to try to make them, to help them develop the way they should be developed.
Are we talking about the, say, third world countries who are from the immigrants, I presume?
Yeah, I just follow up on what you said before.
Yeah, I think the issue is that we need to look at their natural resources, not exploit them, and allow them to benefit from those things, because a lot of those countries are providing very, very valuable resources, cobalt, for example, in some of the Central African states. So I think what Europe needs to do is step away from that and ensure that the people who are coming here are maybe encouraged to go back, but they must go back educated, and they must go back with something to bring back. It's a long game. It is a long game, yes. And, a lot of money spent in a lot of situations and avenues that a lot of people will complain about. Some people would say there's too much money being spent on military hardware. So I personally don't know how much it takes on a yearly basis to do that. But a lot of the people who are coming to Europe from the African states, they're an enterprising people. They don't, they're not going to sit around. Again, it's another myth. We've published an article this week on Europe United about that, about the African community here in Ireland. And these people they want to come here, they want to work, they want to build up a business, they want to have a family, they want to have a future here. So we need to take them in as citizens, and if they decide to stay here, well, then we need to encourage them to be active citizens. And if they want to go home, and then that's a great thing, because they're going back to their country and they're bringing back an array of talents and experiences. But the question is, as I said earlier on, I think we need to maybe give those states and countries an opportunity to develop, so that the need for these people to come abroad maybe is less. Again, I can use my own country as an example. For many, many, many decades, my people left to go to the United States and the UK in particular, because poverty was rife. There was no investment in the country. There was no reason for people to stay. But over a period of time, say the last 25 years, Ireland has become a leader in pharmaceuticals and information technology. And the benefit is that our people are here, they're working here, and the country is a success. So just because we're a European country doesn't mean that we suffer the same problems that, say, third world countries suffer. Because really, on paper, up to the 1940s, Ireland was a third world country. So maybe we should look at the models of success elsewhere around the world and see if we can use those models to help those countries. But the bottom line is we need to develop them and not exploit them.
No, another question now, when you are talking about people going back home. So Hannah has a question. We have a lot of restaurants in England, Portuguese, Turkish, and those people, they don't feel welcome anymore. They are going home. So what are we going to do? What is your suggestion to do about it?
Well, I think that's a problem that maybe Britain needs to answer. It's been a problem that Irish people have experienced for many decades. We all thought it was gone, but I still think it's a minority problem. I don't think that's the majority of British people. I think the majority of British people are open-minded, they are welcoming, and what we're seeing here, it seems to be that the negative side seems to be getting more publicity than the positive side. But again, I can only speak from personal experience. I think those days of no dogs and no Irish is gone.
No,
and yes,
sorry, we are talking about people are not friendly anymore because of the Brexit. Yes. After Brexit.
Yeah, no, I get that, but I don't generally believe it. I think it's something that has been perpetrated and it's been highlighted too much by the media. I still think that the Britain post Brexit will be a friendly country, and to say that it's going to suddenly turn into a xenophobic nation overnight, I don't believe that's going to happen. I think that would be totally untrue.
Michelle was talking about the media, and she thought that in Britain the media has been much more negative about Europe than it has been on the European continent itself. So, I mean, I think you were sort of almost supporting that view in what you said. Hannah's point about people going back from the restaurant trade, though, raises a bigger question about the whole migration issue. I mean, we can say we should be welcoming and all that, but migration was probably one of the biggest issues in the Brexit.
Yes, yeah.
And also a big issue now in mainland Europe. We've seen Italy.
Of course. Yeah.
Refusing to take the boat of migrants recently, Malta refusing, Spain gratefully said that they would. People are now getting worried about, the open door policy. And with that getting worse in the future, especially if we have climate change and we have climate refugees coming along, it's going to create that problem even more. Europe hasn't really successfully developed and managed migration policy, has it? It's always had a knee-jerk reaction, instant reaction policy, not a thought-out managed one.
Yeah, I agree. And is it guilt? I don't know. Is there a certain element of guilt about it because of most of the countries in Europe who seem to be the leaders still in the European Union have some kind of imperial history? I don't know the answer to that question, and I do agree that it needs to be resolved. I actually believe it's the most important question because there needs to be a managed situation. I mean, you can't have these people, dying in the Mediterranean. But at the same time, when we seem to open our doors to them, it's not a universal decision. I think the answer is extremely complex. It requires a number of levels that we have to address. But the first level that we have to address is that we need to make sure that all of the member states are on board, and that will involve convincing them that they need to take a certain amount of people, because right now you cannot have, say, Poland saying we're not taking anyone. That's turning, the European Union into an a la carte situation. So the first probably decision that needs to be made is that people, the states themselves need to be on board universally. It may result in some of the larger countries rolling back on some of the ideas, but simply having it as the status quo as it is at the moment is not going to work, because it's going to cause more fraction and friction. So I think you're right. I think it's the biggest problem we have. And it's such a complex problem, but it is something that they have just constantly put on the long end. And, it wasn't an issue 10, 15 years ago. Now it is an issue. And there needs to be, someone needs to look at it quite extensively and make a decision.
Louise talked about Erasmus student. She was with Sweden, and she was expected to learn Swedish. And the professor was going to give the lessons in Swedish, and she didn't understand very much Swedish, but later on she found out that Erasmus students, they had tailor-made courses in English.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I suppose that the point here is that the language if you are forced to learn a language and try to migrate to a country, it can be difficult or challenging.
Yes, I agree. I think it's getting easier, though. I think generally a lot more people in Europe are speaking English. Certainly I've noticed that. When I went to Poland, say back in 2005, if I was lost in the street, I was lost. But nowadays I find that more and more people are speaking English across Europe. But yeah, definitely language is an issue. It's a big question. What do we do with it? But the only thing I can say is that it is getting easier for people to travel around. So maybe it's probably the solution is to have some kind of universal language, but I think that's quite far off in the future.
Okay. I mean, when you look at a lot of the questions that come up, they are, as they often are in the UK, centered around Brexit. People are so focused on looking at the navel of Brexit and analysing what went wrong and blaming this person or that person, that they're not doing what we started talking about, is saying, where do we go from here? I mean, if we're in or out of Europe, of the EU rather, there's still the question of where does Europe go in the future and what's its relationship to the rest of the world. I mean, there seems to me that there are at least three options, and I just wondered what you thought about that. One is that Europe breaks down into blocks. We have the old EU as it is, and we have other blocks beginning to emerge in Europe. So we have competing blocks in Europe. The other is that with the pressures on Europe, we break down into what used to exist in Europe before, and that's a series of nation states trying to create a balance of power in whatever way they can. And the third option, which used to be on the table and is not discussed as much now as it used to be, and that's we should look for a greater Europe, a new form of Europe, which is collaborative and it involves other countries that are not in the European, maybe even Russia, which has a large, huge European element. And that means a sort of new structure, a new way of doing things. And the term EU has become a sort of almost toxic term for trying to go beyond that and look at Europe in a new way. I mean, how do you respond to those options and that comment?
Oh, well, I think the first one is, it's got, the seeds have been sown. You have to look at the Visegrad group, as well. The only problem I have is that it becomes almost like cultural and racial. Are you going to have an Iberian group? Are you going to have a Slav group? Are you going to have a Celtic group? So I'm not really in favor of that. I think at the end of the day, it would still cause problems. I think to say in a plus in that factor, I think some of the basic elements would remain, so there probably still customs union, freedom of movement. So the general everyday things that people take for granted and enjoy would probably be still there in that situation. I think with the second situation, I think that would be an absolute disaster. I think it would be a disaster, not just in the sense of, say, regards to threats of trade wars and so on, but I think it would be a disaster for the smaller nations of Europe, particularly, say, nations like Ireland or Serbia, Croatia, even some of the more emerging states like Moldova. Also, in terms of democracy, it would be a disaster, because some smaller nations wouldn't be kept in check. They would begin to step out of line, and before you know it, you would have all kinds of setups running across Europe. So I think that the second proposal is something that we should avoid at all costs. Which gives us to the third proposal, which I suppose in a sense is a federalist idea, but you seem to be going for a much larger concept. I think, yes, I think it's a possibility. I think we're looking at it in the very far future. I don't think you'll probably see it in my lifetime, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't work for it. Even if we were to adopt a federalist system, I still believe that would probably be a multi-tier system. Ireland is 92% apparently in favour of European Union membership, but I think if we asked the question, would they become a state within the United States of Europe, I probably think that percentage would drop. So that requires, again, convincing people and making sure that the proposal of some kind of federalism is solid and that's got the answer to every question, because I don't actually think that a lot of the federalists do have the answers to every question. So I would like to see the third option, but I do think it's a very slow process, which would involve baby steps. So we need to obviously have some kind of monetary union. We need to have probably a better universal healthcare system going across the whole of Europe. There needs to be maybe universal basic income. And I think what happens is when you give people a better standard of living, they probably become they enjoy the social setup a little bit more. So it's going back again to having the people involved. I think if we are to keep Europe together, we need to make sure that the people are involved, and we need to make sure that we give the people the basic tools that they require to have a good standard of living.
Okay, I mean, that brings us to another question about democracy, and Sharon raises it. She says trusting democracy is fine when people participate and engage, and how do we encourage people to vote? But it's more than that, isn't it? There's a democratic deficit. I mean, how do you have democracy in a unit of 300 people, or 300 million people? How do you create democracy so people feel that they want to engage? Part of Brexit was about people feeling that they could not participate in the decision-making of Europe, and they wanted a smaller unit to do it. Now, I think many of those arguments were misplaced, because you can't do it in Britain either, and you need even smaller units than that. But the democratic deficit problem is huge, isn't it? And unless we deal with it, we are going to get a lot of people wanting to opt out of a larger Europe of whatever kind it is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where civil society steps in. And we need to look at, say, well, okay, if we're going to have a united Europe, there needs to be a new form of democracy. Now, whether it be a combination of existing forms, or whether it be something completely different, some kind of, I don't know, positive communism. I hate using that term. But there needs to be a working group that looks at that and looks at how all of the rest of the other major federal unions across the world do it, and work on it and develop our own based on those principles. I certainly wouldn't have enough background knowledge to be able to come up with some kind of detailed plan on it, but I do agree with the question. I think that democracy has to develop. And as you say earlier on, some people like Orban would still consider themselves the ultimate Democrat. So all sides need to be talked to, all sides need to be listened, all avenues and all various concepts need to be explored. But what we can't do is we can't just keep going as we are. We can't keep doing this kind of way of having either kind of a pseudo state. It needs to be something more solid. But as I say, they need to take their time with it, because it's not going to get any worse, I don't believe, but it's certainly not going to get any better but they need to take their time. If they rush into it, and if they start pushing the idea of a united Europe onto people at this stage, I think it could be detrimental to the whole concept. So my answer is that yes, I do believe that the democracy does need to change. And how do we get people more involved? I would say again, local decisions made at a local level, and that the people can actually get really well informed. So you got to invest in education and make sure that people are, if there is going to be a referendum on a local issue, that people know all the facts before they make an informed decision. And they'll get, once that happens, people will get used to that, they'll expect it, and they'll want it. And then when the bigger decisions come along, they'll ask for it. And once you apply the same principle, I believe it can be a success. So democracy has to be more interactive as well, and it has to be more informed. But that's my limited education on that can give you. That's all I can say to you on that, you know.
Okay, well, Neil agrees that it's very difficult to have democracy in a unit of 300 million people. Fong, do you have any other question before we do the last?
Yes, Neil also has a question about if you catered for all the people, that they would have a like kind of a control over world politics. So,
well,
yeah.
And I think the definition, what is an older person? Some people would say I'm an older person. So I don't know, I can't really answer that question. I probably need more information on what Neil means about that. Look, everyone has an equal vote, regardless of how old they are. And I can counter that because in Ireland, when we had the abortion referendum here, quite a substantial amount of people over 35 voted yes. So I think people's attitudes are changing. I think older people are more, informed, and they're more open to change than people give them credit for. Europe's not just about the youth.
Yeah, he's talking more about the control over the world politics. So he's talking about if you cater for all the people and they would start to take control, and then how about the weapons? How about the arms? The UK and the US, who should they sell? Yeah, who should they sell arms to?
Well, I think Europe is bucking that trend. I mean, if you look at the leaders in Europe, most of them are pushing around 45 now at this stage. We've Leo Varadkar here in Ireland, who's in his late 30s. We have Sebastian Kurz, Spain's new premier, is quite young. So, I mean, the leaders of Europe certainly are coming from a younger trend. So, but that's a kind of a very hypothetical question, and I can't really answer it. I probably need more information on it, you know.
Okay, well, I must say I defined older people as people who are much older than me. So,
sometimes it depends on where I am, Francis. It depends on where I am.
I know. Well, I understand that. I mean, the talking about arms control and so on takes us back to the why Europe was founded in the first place. I mean, it was founded in the belief that you had to have people working together in a very sort of solid collaborative framework to prevent war developing. And in fact, you can look at the history of Europe to see that when peace took place, it was when there was some sort of concert of Europe of some kind or the other.
Yes.
And when war happened is when that concert of Europe, whatever the form it was, broke down. How important is it for you to make sure that Europe works together in concert in that way if we're going to maintain peace on our continent?
Yeah, I think they've showed that over the last few months. I mean, look, we have a very volatile situation in the United States, in a sense that we have a president there who seems to be just, making decisions off the cuff. But the one positive thing I've seen is that we have the leaders of Europe who are generally, even some who would be considered right-wing, are still quite moderate. So, we can talk about Orban and we can talk about Kaczynski, right? But the real, when you look at the real leaders in, say, like Merkel and so on, they are working together when it comes to that. So I think that in terms, to answer your question, I think it's probably something that Europe is constantly working on. Now, the obvious question is, do we need, a single military structure? And they're working towards that with the recent agreements. But I'm glad to find that it's not really top of the list. I still think top of the list in terms of Europe, a future Europe, should be making sure that the European people are happy and that they're involved. So European influence over the world is still very strong. It's still quite strong, even at an individual level, say like Britain and France. The only problem I might have is that with Britain leaving the European Union, I think in a sense that's a great loss to the influence of the European Union, because Britain had a good history of diplomacy and so on, and they brought a lot to the table at the European level. So Europe must make sure that even if Britain has left the EU, that Britain should still be involved when it comes to peace in Europe, and peace being represented by Europe.
I mean, finally, I mean, you say that Europe still has an important and big role in the world, but isn't one of the problems that Europe's going through is a problem of identity, because it's having less power? We're seeing the growth of China, we're seeing the growth of Southeast Asia, we're seeing the growth of Latin America. The United States of America is in relative decline, and Europe is in relative decline. Really trying to find out where our new role is in the globe. It's not just about Britain and Europe, it's about in the world, and we've got to come to terms with the new world that's growing as well, don't we?
Yeah, I do. And obviously, I would give you an answer to say that unity is the answer to that question, and becoming whatever. I do not care what they call it, whether it be the United States of Europe or a federal union of Europe. I think it's the only answer, because the great powers, as we all call them, they're no longer so great. And this is the way the world works. You go back 500 years and we had different great powers. So the answer is, when it comes to technology, when it comes to information, when it comes to travel, and when it comes to all of those things that human beings enjoy, the world is a smaller place. It's a more united place. So I think that we should adopt that policy in terms of how we are in Europe. I think Europe needs to be more united. I'm not too concerned about whether it's going to be a federal Europe or a confederal Europe. I don't really mind, but it needs to be thinking about being more united. And as a united, say, set of states or a united union, we would reset that balance. We would hit the reboot button, and Europe would come to the table with maybe a chair on the United Nations as Europe, something like that, and have more influence as an entity, a single entity, because the days of France or Britain or Germany or whatever, being able to, as you say, exert bigger influence over the likes of China and Southeast Asia, that may be gone. We're not so, but again, I'm not so sure, because I mean, we used to talk, I'm old enough, and I'm sure you're not, Francis, to remember that Japan, we used to talk about Japan like this. We used to say Japan was going to, completely control China, the Eastern and West, through its huge infrastructure and huge economics, but that has changed. So the world is moving so fast that 5 years from now, we may not know what the setup is. But I think we need to think big, but we also need to think European. I don't think we need to think too big. And as I say, baby steps is the key. Make sure that people are on board. Make the next 10 years a plan to bring Europe closer together. We may lose people along the way. There's no doubt. We may lose nations along the way. But if they decide to step outside the concept of a closer Europe, we should not push them away from Europe. They should still be a European nation, and we should still be willing to treat them as a European nation.
No, that's a good way to finish. So thanks for doing that, Ken. I mean, we've come to the end of our hour now, and it's been a good discussion. And I mean, I'm talking to Ken maybe in the future about doing some future webinars around Europe and the globe and the whole area of global governance, which I think is something we don't give enough attention to in a world that's very fragile and very often is on the edge. And I think we need to give a lot more thought to that, and I hope we will in the future. So thanks for starting it, Ken, and for doing this. This was a sort of pilot of how we might do it and how we might develop it in the future. So thank you all for taking part both on the Zoom webinar platform and on Facebook, and quite a few of you have come on Facebook. And I hope you thought it was worthwhile discussion. Remember, this will be recorded, and it will also go up on YouTube tomorrow or the day after. And so it'll be there for you to watch and to see then. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll finish this webinar now.